The story of American women serving their country as nurses has a long history, dating back to 1775 when General Washington asked Congress for a matron to supervise the nurses, bedding, etc. Women have always been included in American military efforts. But it wasn't until 1899 that the Army recognized the need to establish a permanent nurse corps to clarify and officially regulate the status of the women who served. When the United States entered World War I, there were 403 nurses on active duty. By war's end in November of 1918, the U.S. had on hand over 21,000 female nurses serving in the Army Nurse Corps, with roughly half that number, more than 10,000, deployed overseas. Most were dispatched to France, while others served in England and Italy. World War I, therefore, with its backdrop of American sacrifice and heroism, proves to be a defining moment for uniformed women, altering perceptions of their role and status, both abroad and at home. This program tells the story of the Army nurses of World War I as seen through the eyes of two women, Emma Elizabeth Weaver and Elizabeth Lewis. In their own words, through their collected letters and writings, Weaver and Lewis preserve a vivid and vital record of the nurse experience of this era. The 20th century, often called the bloodiest century, saw two key advances in its dawning: better tools for waging war, and better methods for treating the sick and wounded. Weapons of war became easier to mass produce and more effective in their destructive capabilities. At the same time, the field of medicine was yielding new treatments and procedures for saving the lives of the millions who would suffer devastating injuries and illnesses from war. The First World War would be the event that brought both of these amazing accomplishments to American public awareness.
Wake up, America, if we are called to war, are we prepared to give our lives for our sweethearts and our wives, for our mothers and our homes worth fighting for?
Like the young men who entered military service during World War I, the women of the Army Nurse Corps represent a diverse cross-section of early 20th century America. Their reasons for joining the Army Nurse Corps were as varied as their backgrounds. Adventurous spirits viewed service in the Corps as an opportunity to travel to Europe and explore the world. Others, motivated by a spirit of patriotism, embraced the opportunity to serve their country in one of the few vocations available to them, nursing. Regardless of their motivation, these women shared a common calling and were willing to risk their own lives to tend to the soldiers that needed them.
America, I love you. You're like the sweetheart of my heart. From ocean to ocean, for you my devotion is touching its boundary line, every boundary line, just like a little baby climbing its mother's knee. America, I love you, and there's 100 million others like me.
Emma Elizabeth Weaver was a graduate of the University of Pennsylvania School of Nursing. When World War I started, she decided that she would become a member of the Army Nurse Corps. What makes Miss Weaver rather special, she joined the Army Nurse Corps at the age of 39. During her service overseas, she kept all her notes, her letters. After the war was over, she finally returns to the United States and puts together a journal. This journal tells her story as seen through her eyes. Elizabeth Lewis was a much younger person when she joined the Army Nurse Corps. She specialized in infirmities of the eyes and the ears, which made it very, very important when she was serving overseas in France. From Elizabeth Lewis's letters, you get a very personal account. You have a sense of her trepidation, and you can get a sense of the care that she felt for the soldiers that she would tend to.
After enlisting in the Nurse Corps, Elizabeth Lewis's eagerness for deployment was fueled even more by a nurse who gave a lecture on her experiences in France. She recounted the presentation in one of her earliest letters to her sister.
One of the return nurses gave a lecture on her work in France last night. She said there were many hardships we had to go through, but there was more satisfaction in it than anything we had ever done or ever would do. She said they, the soldiers, appreciated everything you did so much that it made you forget the hard part of it. I say anything to Mother, but all of them here are back on account of ill health, and many nurses have contracted tuberculosis, more commonly called consumption, from exposure in the fearful damp cold. They all say they were sorry to come back. They are just crazy about the work. Wish you would keep my letters, as I would like to read them when I come back, as we are not allowed to keep a diary.
Before departing for Europe, many of the enlisted nurses were processed at Ellis Island, New York. Just as their male counterparts in the Army had done, the nurses drilled and trained to prepare themselves for the difficult work and conditions that awaited them in Europe.
I joined the service February 16th, took the oath of allegiance, and was sworn in at University of Pennsylvania Hospital. Next day, Sunday, was busy packing. The 65 nurses at the University of Pennsylvania left Broad Street Station for Ellis Island, New York, which was their mobilization center. A fairly large crowd had collected at the station to see us depart, and we were given flowers and fruit. On the way to New York, we passed a long train of khaki-clad raw recruits. We flocked to the windows, and there was wild cheering and waving and exchanging of salutes. From New York, we crossed to Ellis Island on the ferry boat. Ellis Island was under martial law, guards everywhere on duty. No one was allowed on the island unless they were connected with the government. There was roll call every morning at 9 a.m., drill every day, by an important second lieutenant who makes us stand around and instructs us in Army discipline. The first days on Ellis Island were devoted to getting our equipment. Quite a task. Uncle Sam and the Red Cross gave us a very adequate and appropriate outfit. Good-looking dark blue serge suits, dark blue cloth overcoats. We wear the U.S. insignia on the collars. Also, the Army Nurse Corps medical caducei, dark blue hat to match, chin strap for windy weather. When new, the outfit looks quite military. Tan shoes and tan gloves complete the U.S. Army nurse outdoor or traveling uniform.
The women's uniforms for all the branches of service were almost an afterthought, inasmuch as that they were designed as a slightly more feminine version of the utilitarian uniforms worn by the men. They mimicked the colors, the rank designs, the pocket designs, and the epaulette design. The uniforms were very derivative of the late 19th century and early 20th century style, and so this fashion motif may have drawn women in that may not have thought about serving in that capacity. And I think we see again this shift in society from the place of the woman being on the pedestal and being a caregiver and a nurturer into being more of an active participant.
War had been raging for years when the American Army took to battle in 1917. The time and resources needed to bury the dead civilians and soldiers were not always available. Poor sanitary conditions and hygiene also contributed to an environment teeming with viruses and bacteria. Servicemen and servicewomen had to be vaccinated against diseases like smallpox, typhoid, and paratyphoid. The battery of vaccinations was essential to maintain an effective military force.
made a will, and went to Hoboken for identification cards and had fingerprints taken. Had my picture taken for the identification card. Awful. There was an endless amount of red tape connected with our preparation for overseas service. Paratyphoid and typhoid inoculations and vaccinations for smallpox.
I haven't been on duty yet, and you can't imagine how thankful I am. For talk about a sore arm. This morning I had my third and last dose of the typhoid doses and was vaccinated for the third time. They haven't been able to get one that would take on me.
At the beginning of the war, medical officers insisted that all soldiers have vaccination shots for typhoid. The threat of infection was very, very serious, and therefore Elizabeth Weaver, Elizabeth Lewis, and all soldiers going overseas had to have their shots.
At the beginning of the war, the medical officers of the regular army feared the dangers of a typhoid fever epidemic among the soldiers reporting for training all over the United States. In the American Civil War and the 1898 war with Spain, typhoid fever was one of the greatest disease threats facing the Army. After the Spanish-American War, indoor plumbing, window screening, and basic improvements in hygiene had already reduced the occurrence of typhoid fever in the United States. However, in France, 3 years of war had created an environment rich with infection, so all Army personnel were mandated to receive typhoid, paratyphoid, and other vaccinations.
Goodbye, Broadway, hello, France, we're 10 million strong. Goodbye, sweetheart, wives and lovers, it won't take us long.
If you should receive a card from me saying I was in New York, you would know we were getting our equipment and were about ready to sail. After you get it, don't say anything to anyone about it, as it must be kept secret. This is very important as we go over on a transport with the soldiers. You know the Germans have a wonderful spy system, and we are trying to fool them in every way possible.
Keep the home fires burning while your hearts are yearning. Though your lads are far away, they dream of home. There's a silver light.
Our group left Ellis Island Monday, April 22nd in the Holyoke. Came aboard the Leviathan, then commenced her voyage across the Atlantic, arriving at Brest on May 2nd after 8 days at sea.
When America entered the war, it seized many of the assets of the German government, both material as well as financial. Included among these were many ships of the German merchant fleet that were in American ports at the beginning of the war. Other ships were held by the American government and used throughout the war as transport ships for troops and supplies to Europe. At the cessation of hostilities, all these ships formally transferred their title to the American fleet or different companies, and there was no compensation paid to any of the previous German owners.
Just as the bombing of Pearl Harbor triggered a series of events that led the United States into a European invasion during World War II, the sinking of the British ocean liner Lusitania by a German submarine ultimately brought the United States into the First World War. In his speech to Congress on April 2, 1917, then-President Woodrow Wilson lobbied for a congressional declaration of war on Germany, revealing the threat of German imperialism in the world's oceans facilitated by their underwater attack vessels, or U-boats. Since all the waters of the Eastern Hemisphere were treated as hostile areas by German submarines, the transport boats that carried the Army soldiers and nurses were under a constant threat of attack.
They have a certain number of blasts on the whistle in case of a submarine. To show you how I sleep, it was foggy the other night, and the whistle blew, and I never heard it. The nurse in the bunk up over me said, "You would never know if a submarine did strike us." I said, "There isn't any use crossing that bridge until you come to it. I intend to sleep when I have a chance to."
We have abandoned ship drill several times each day on our deck. The nurses line up in 2 long rows in their life belts and march out to the lifeboat to which they have been assigned. There is no confusion or crowding. Each boat holds 29 people, including the sailor boys who row. We don't know where we are going. The vessel seems to be taking a zigzag course. It is said this ship never takes the same course twice. Torpedoes are aimed at the Leviathan every trip it has made, but fortunately so far have missed. We were convoyed only 24 hours. The Leviathan relied on her speed to escape the submarines.
After 2 weeks of heightened tension on the convoy to Europe, Elizabeth Weaver describes her arrival. It felt good for her to see land again, she writes. The morning was foggy and the low hills of France rose through the mist. She asks, is it possible, while looking at this beautiful, peaceful countryside, that war is raging just a short distance away?
After long, intense training and a voyage across the Atlantic, the nurses landed in France to a hearty welcome by its citizens. Although accommodations were modest at best, the large number of American soldiers and nurses enjoyed the hospitality of their host country.
France, we have heard you calling. France, while the shells are falling, we know what we owe to you. So your head is bowed.
Vive la France! We've come. We heard you calling us. The Leviathan, being so huge and able to dock at only 3 ports in the world, was obliged to anchor in the harbor, several miles from shore and unloaded by smaller boats. The soldiers marched out single file by the hundreds. They wore their full equipment: overcoat, cartridge belt, bayonet, blanket roll, canteen, trench hat. A few had tomahawks. The equipment averages about 65 pounds. The unloading of troops went on all night. The bands play and the boys sing. We sang Pennsylvania songs when our medical unit went ashore. The nurses are spending several days on the Leviathan, for there are no accommodations for them in Brest.
By popular accord, American nurses were considered the finest in the world. However, this didn't seem to convey with it the sense of status that was felt among other members of the military. They were initially viewed as almost second-class citizens, necessary when needed, but not a part of this great mobilization. These perceptions changed throughout the course of the war as their competence and their professional knowledge came to the fore. They were initially only on contract. They were not an official part of the Army. They didn't have official status or rank, and their pay and transportation costs were all something that they had to send in for receipts for reimbursement, and the payment of these were very untimely. In short, they were treated much worse than their male counterparts. The dichotomy between how men and women in the Army were treated in the First World War mirrored the more general confusion in American society over the place of women in the war effort. Did they belong at home as nurturers, or did they belong in the armed services overseas and supporting the war effort? We can see this change in the posters of the late war period that show women as a much more active participant in the war effort as well as the efforts at home. And I think this mirrors the status of women as they're viewed in society and the changes that occurred during the First World War, bringing them from out of the house and actually into the workforce, into the military, and into American society at large.
The American men and women had only a short time to partake in the celebration of their arrival. As welcomed as the people of France made the Americans feel, war was the reason they were here, and their allies in battle would welcome their arrival even more.
At last we board our train and are on our journey to our unknown destination. Such a wonderful reception. Hundreds of people came to meet the train at every village. We would say, "Vive la France!" They would respond, "Vive l'Amérique" and "L'Américain." The Red Cross people came to meet the train with hot coffee.
As the war raged on, Europe would have to accommodate both its warriors and its wounded. Hospitals and other treatment centers for serving the public during times of peace were not nearly adequate for treating the thousands in need of care. So other structures would be converted to medical facilities all across the continent. Hotels were a natural choice for serving as wartime hospitals. In many Ally-controlled cities, the task of performing this transformation was assigned to nurses.
When we arrived at Châtel-Guyon, the nurses marched 2 by 2 up to the Du Parc Hotel. We took over all the hotels except the Continental and turned them into hospitals. Busy days getting the hotels in order. No easy job to turn a hotel into a hospital. The Corps boys are organized into squads for cleaning. The walls and floors have to be scrubbed. The nurses assist cleaning and scrubbing for 1 week until everything looks immaculate. I can't tell you where this is. All I can say is it is Base Hospital number 15. This is my second day on duty here, and I have been on duty in 4 different wards. This afternoon I am taking the place of one of the charge nurses. I hope nothing new happens before she arrives back, for I feel kind of green over here. Don't know how long we will be here or anything about it, so we are still living out of our suitcases. This tramping around makes me think of the poster that used to be stuck up at home like this: "Join the army and see the world." This is just about what we are doing. We have been almost the whole length of France and England. Oh, this is a great life, I can tell you. On June 1st, an order came from headquarters for 26 nurses to proceed to the front. Those who first volunteered were selected. Such a scurrying around to get ready. In the confusion, the lights went out, so we had to pack our trunks by the light of tallow candles. We got to bed about midnight. Next morning, we took the train to Paris at Châtel-Guyon. From there, we arrived at Bassoy at 7:30 p.m.
There's a girl at the front among the soldiers. She's one of 1,000 girls or more who works with the heart of an angel, with the sound of the cannon's roar.
One of the most horrendous weapons employed by both sides was toxic gas. Because of the indiscriminate nature of this type of weapon, all participants in battle, as well as any civilians in the vicinity, were potential victims. The effects were devastating, both to the military forces and their morale. The first attempts at protective devices against the chemical assaults were poorly designed and mostly ineffective. The nurses tended to many victims who suffered severe or fatal gas-related illnesses and injuries.
The Red Cross ambulance came to the station to meet us, and I went on duty on the gas ward. The Hun employed 3 kinds of gas at this time: chlorine, phosgene, and mustard, the latter usually causing skin burns. Phosgene was especially detrimental to respiratory passages. Base 18 at this time was about 15 miles from the front. If the wind came in a certain direction, we could hear the roar of the big guns. We were in constant danger of gas attack and always slept with our gas masks at the head of our bed. At the end of 2 weeks, we were sent back to our base at Châtel-Guyon.
Elizabeth Lewis writes her sister about her own preparations for the possibility of gas warfare on September 5, 1918.
We were issued our gas masks and tin hats a couple of days ago. I practice putting it on each day and have it down pretty pat now. I can get it on in a few seconds. We expect to go up to the front soon on operating teams. That is what they were issued to us for.
The introduction of poison gas came about through the German chemical manufacturing companies as a way to break the stalemate on the Western Front. In April of 1915, the Germans opened the valves to over 6,000 cylinders of chlorine gas, which drifted forward into the positions of French colonial troops. As the troops began to choke on this greenish-yellow cloud, their buttons on their tunics corroded, they began to bleed through their mouths and noses. They fled in panic. The line collapsed. The Germans were able to advance and capture the line without any casualties, at the same time taking over 2,000 French captives. The British retaliated in September of 1915 at Loos in Belgium by loosing gas on the Germans as well. The anti-gas measures designed to protect the soldiers from the effects of the poison gas began simply with wadding of cotton tied across the mouths, soaked in chemicals, or handkerchiefs dipped in urine. Eventually, these evolved into more complex systems designed to protect the soldiers better. The height of the gas mask was the small box respirator, which included a small charcoal canister through which the poison gas was filtered via a hose into the gas mask face. This protected the soldier from the vesicant gases as well as those that would affect his lungs. And it's become the iconic image of the First World War, these insect-like faces fighting one another across no man's land through this fog of greenish-yellow gas.
Base Hospital Number 20 was originally planned as a 500-bed unit with 50 nurses attending, a coverage ratio of 10 patients to every 1 nurse. But it soon grew in size, peaking at nearly 2,300 patients. Complicating matters, nurses were often diverted to emergency teams or laid aside by illness. Waves of casualties strained resources beyond capacity, requiring a nurse to attend not to 10, but to 60 patients at a time.
On my return, went on duty on Ward A, surgical. At first was not very interesting, as most of the patients were in a convalescent stage. This condition did not last very long. The first patient was admitted to Base Hospital Number 20, May 29, 1918. After that, a constant stream of medical cases flowed through the wards until Base Hospital 20 was officially closed January 20, 1919. At times the service was light. Then again there were periods of marked activity, especially when the Red Cross trains arrived.
In 1914, when the conflict began, many of the combatants figured the war would be over by that Christmas. 4 years later, World War I had caused casualties on a monumental scale far beyond that envisioned by any of the combatant nations. A total of 37 million combatants were casualties during the First World War. That includes killed, wounded, and missing, many of whom lost to this day in the fields of mud that became the trenches. By contrast, the United States, by virtue of its late entry into the war, suffered a relatively low number of casualties. 260,775 were killed, wounded, or missing in action. This represented only 6% of the American force.
The first train of patients, 359 cases, arrived on June 8. These were medical and surgical cases. As more trains arrived, one building after another would be opened. As a rule, a Red Cross train seldom carried less than 300 cases. Many gassed with phosgene, mustard, and chlorine gas. Many acute surgical cases had to be operated on. These patients came directly from the Château Thierry front and were among the early casualties of the Second Battle of Château Thierry. We are terribly busy, patients coming in from all fronts, many direct from the battlefield, many terribly mangled and shot to pieces. Now 2,200 patients, 38 nurses. You can imagine the nature of our duties. We certainly need more nurses. We have mustard, phosgene, and chlorine gas cases. The mustard gas causes horrible body burns. A patient was brought in one day wrapped in a blanket, no clothing. His body burned black and literally raw. Face black, eyes completely swollen shut, and he was suffering agonies. This was a case of mustard gas burns. Another patient, gasping and coughing, blue in the face, intense pain in his chest on every respiration. This was a case of phosgene gas poisoning. The wounds are caused mostly by high explosives, machine gun bullets, and shrapnel. A Kansas farmer boy was brought in. Half his abdomen was shot away and intestines protruding. Bishop Israel gave him last sacrificial rites before he was rushed to the operating room. He had been driving a soup kitchen. Next thing he knew, both horses had been shot away. He was still sitting with the reins in his hand when he discovered he had been wounded. When the convoys came in from the front, we worked about 20 hours out of 24. Then, too, we had occasional cases of diphtheria, scarlet fever, and meningitis develop. When will this war cease? This terrible wreckage of humanity that pours in from the front is appalling.
Like infantrymen, nurses were frequently deployed to positions close to combat zones. While they were physically at risk of becoming wounded or casualties themselves, witnessing the destruction of war took its toll psychologically as well.
We were fortunate enough to go through a city which had, as very recently, been taken from the Germans by the Americans. You ought to have seen it. There wasn't a single house but what was in ruins. The roads had been shelled, and the bridge had been all blown to pieces. We rode for miles through no man's land and saw the German trenches and the entanglement of barbed wire. We saw dead horses laying around. We traveled a long time and never saw a civilian. Nothing but soldiers. We can hear the gun pounding away. This is nearer the front than we were, and the towns near here have been shelled all to pieces. We have been put on the night operating shift, so we have to go on from 7 p.m. to 7 a.m. There was a chaplain that had services in the triage this morning. It was the first church service I have had a chance to attend in France.
At 11 a.m. on November 11, 1918, the guns all across the span of the Western Front fell silent. In accordance with an agreement signed earlier that morning by representatives of the Allied and German armies, all fighting between the two opposing forces was immediately halted. The 3 million-strong German army, demoralized and weary, began its retreat to the pre-war German border where it was to be immediately demobilized. The 3 Allied armies, American, British, and French, followed the retreating Germans to the banks of the Rhine River, where they prepared for their new task as victorious occupiers. The First World War was officially over, but the work for the American Army was far from complete.
It's a long way to Berlin, but we'll get there. Uncle Sam will show the way. Over the lines and across the Rhine, shouting hip hip hooray.
There has been so much happening since I last wrote, I hardly know where to begin. The first and great important thing is the ending of this war. I can just imagine the celebration of the people at home are having. As we are near the front, we could always hear the firing. At 11 a.m., the last shot was fired, and there is a city, Verdun, we are near, that has been shelled to pieces. The cathedral is in ruins, and the clock and steeple is about the only thing left. At 11:30 a.m., the day the war ended, the chimes rang from the cathedral for the first time since the war started. The French had a big celebration there yesterday and last night. The boys up at the front are celebrating. We can see where they are shooting star shells. They look like skyrockets. They are very pretty.
The end of the war didn't signal the return of all Army nurses to American soil. Many volunteered to stay behind with the Army of Occupation in Germany.
The Army would need several weeks to evacuate its wounded, and as long as there were people in need of care, the Nurse Corps would remain in Europe. In addition to tending after patients, the nurses were also needed to inventory and pack the medical equipment and supplies for shipment. But knowing that the worst was over and feeling satisfaction from the work they had done raised the spirits of the women who were looking forward to the journey home.
Our base is not packed and has about 2,000 patients at present. Looks as though we would be here until they got the wounded about all back, except that will take a couple of months yet. On March 29, 1919, our chief nurse came and woke us at 5:30 a.m. and said to have our suitcases ready at 7 a.m. as we were leaving that morning. Such a happy crowd you never saw.
Although most members of the Army Nurse Corps returned from war shortly after the conflict was over, some stayed behind voluntarily to continue their service.
I put in papers for application for further service in Germany with the 3rd Army or the Army of Occupation. Fortunately, I, with 14 other nurses of Base 20, was accepted and officially appointed to go into Germany and join the Army of Occupation.
Weaver was sent to Koblenz, Germany, as part of the Allied occupation force. The echo of gunfire had long fallen silent, and many of the wounded had healed and returned home. But the twin menace of Spanish influenza and pneumonia would soon sweep across the regions, afflicting thousands. As working conditions worsened, the responsibilities of the nurses grew more difficult.
Well, here we are, and I have been on duty for the last 2 days. I was sent on duty on Ward A, the influenza and pneumonia ward. 1,600 patients. This is the coldest place I've encountered since leaving home. I can readily understand why the German women wear woolen stockings and flannel petticoats. We have old stoves to heat these big, bare rooms. I often wear my sweater and big trench coat while sitting in our dormitory. It is so very cold. I am now in a large military hospital. This is without exception one of the darkest phases I've passed through since I left the USA. The terrible epidemic of Spanish influenza is raging in the Army of Occupation. I don't know if it has been officially given out or not, but I suppose you do read of it in the American papers. I understand the flu was prevalent in America, too.
Following the war, the occupation in Germany dealt with a great many cases of pneumonia and influenza, so much so that soldiers overseas were worried about relatives at home in America, and in America, many nurses were employed in dealing with this epidemic, especially at the large training camps where the soldiers were being trained and mobilized, or the demobilization of soldiers returning from Europe. It's ironic that in this large-scale carnage of the First World War, the greatest number of casualties suffered by the Army Nurse Corps were those that fell victim to the Spanish influenza pandemic.
I am on night duty on the pneumonia ward. Pneumonia following Spanish flu. It is a terrible combination. On this ward alone, I have had 52 deaths. It is distressing. I feel as though I have lived centuries since I'm here, but not for one single instant do I regret coming. All night long I give treatments, hypodermics, nourishment, medicines, etc. Very often I don't have time to snatch a bite of lunch, and more often I don't have an appetite. I can't sleep very well in the daytime. All the night nurses sleep in the attic, which is full of army cots under the rafters. I am very much disturbed by the explosions of ammunition. When the Americans took possession of Ehrenbreitstein, they found it stored full of ammunition. The American commander-in-chief ordered all this ammunition removed and destroyed. When it was set off, it made such a terrible noise that it jarred buildings and shattered window panes, and often, just as I was going off to sleep, there would be a terrific explosion rocking my little army cot and waking me up.
Tending to patients with contagious illnesses carried obvious risks. Despite the danger, the nurses carried out their duties with distinction. Eventually, the inevitable became their reality. The weather, living conditions, and contagion took their toll upon the nurses, claiming the lives of many.
Miss Golden, one of our nurses, contracted pneumonia and died. She was buried in a white uniform, and the American flag draped her plain board coffin, unpainted and not lined inside, which was the regulation casket for all members of the AEF. It was a strictly military funeral. I am still in charge of A6 ward, all pulmonary cases. 6 positive tubercular cases, 20 TB suspects, convalescent pneumonias, bronchitis, and pleurisy. I feel so sorry for the tubercular patients. They came over here fine, healthy boys. But sleeping and living in the mud and rain and exposed to all sorts of inclement weather conditions, they contracted tuberculosis. They will be sent home. The American people will never realize what these boys have faced, the hardships they endured.
Once the patients were evacuated, Lewis's return home was rather swift. They left the hospitals, their duties completed, and their lives changed forever. Memories, good and bad, would remain vivid for years. Victory in Europe was secured, and it was time to go home.
Gee, I tell you, the boat looked mighty good to us. When we got on, we found it was one of the White Star line boats, the same line that we came over on. We are well out into the Atlantic now. Yesterday we ran into a couple of squalls, but nothing bad. I haven't been seasick yet. You can't imagine what a grand feeling it is to think that every hour brings us nearer to the good old USA.
Weaver finally left Koblenz on August 6th, arrived in Paris on August 7th, and went on to Brest, where all waited for orders to sail.
28 transports are lying in the harbor waiting to carry us across the big Atlantic to the USA. The camp at Brest is an enormous military camp. It covers miles and is laid out in streets with duckboards for footpaths. There are thousands of soldiers here now, all awaiting transportation to America. On August 15, 1919, we returned on the Susquehanna. There was a complete lack of enthusiasm. We lifted anchor about 2 p.m., and the shores of France were fast receding. I felt very sorrowful, for I had many pleasant recollections of the AEF. I loved La Belle France and enjoyed my work in Germany. It took us 12 days to cross. Very soon, far in the distance, we saw the very faint glimmering light, now appearing, now disappearing. Sometime afterward, another light, then another later on. They were Montauk Point, Sandy Hook, and Ambrose Light. It gave us a very queer sensation, for we knew we were approaching our native shore. I was too excited to sleep. I went up on the top deck, then down to my bunk. I buried my old blue army coat at sea at 12 a.m. I held a military funeral for it. It served me long and well, and I consigned it to the deep through the porthole. Our boat moved slowly onward. We passed the Statue of Liberty, who had been waiting for us all the while, past all the piers and docks, past Battery Park and Ellis Island. The New York Reception Committee boat came out to meet us, playing Home Sweet Home and Hail, Hail, the Gang's All Here, waving American flags. We steamed into the pier at Hoboken, back to the point from which we started. Then we disembarked, marching down the gangplank. The Red Cross ladies met us and gave us good hot coffee, prune pie, a big roll, and ice cream. Fini la guerre pour moi. Yes, fini la guerre pour moi. Oui, oui. Au revoir.
The nurses of the Army, women like Elizabeth Lewis and Emma Elizabeth Weaver, were transformed by their journey. They boarded ships at Ellis Island, some with a genuine heart for service, others with a naive desire to see the world as promised by recruitment posters of the day. Arriving on foreign shores, the military establishment sometimes viewed them as a distraction to discipline and order. But they discovered in their labors a satisfaction that knew no regret despite the horrors of modern warfare. Tending to the burned and broken, enduring disease and exhaustion, the heartfelt appreciation of the soldiers sustained them. Through their labors, they outgrew the garb of mere matrons and wore a new status in the eyes of their countrymen, as co-defenders of the values of the American homeland. This shift in popular perception was soon felt by all Americans. In September of 1918, President Woodrow Wilson addressed the Senate, seeking recognition for the contributions made by American women during World War I.
We have made partners of the women in this war. Shall we admit them only to a partnership of suffering and sacrifice and toil, and not to a partnership of privilege and right?
It is no coincidence, therefore, that the 19th Amendment was passed by both houses of Congress in 1919 and ratified in 1920 by President Wilson. It granted citizens of the United States the right to vote without regard to gender. Lewis and Weaver's journey ended where it began, in New York Harbor. And like so many that passed that way before, They found themselves new citizens in a new world. Thank you for watching this presentation of the American World War I Army Nurse Corps.